The silence in that Connecticut mansion was different that Tuesday morning. Not the peaceful quiet of a well-ordered home, but the heavy stillness that settles over a house when secrets are about to spill into the open. I had been working as a housekeeper for the wealthy families of Greenwich for over 20 years, but nothing had prepared me for what I would witness in the Morrison estate that day. The envelope Maria Santos clutched in her trembling hands contained more than just a severance check. It contained enough money to break the internet, and enough truth to destroy a family's carefully constructed lies. My name doesn't matter in this story, but what I saw does. At 62, I thought I had seen every kind of family drama that money could buy. I was wrong. The morning Maria was handed that check and told to leave immediately, I watched a loyal woman's 15-year dedication get reduced to a single transaction. But what the Morrison family didn't realize was that their attempt to buy Maria's silence would instead expose the very secrets they were desperate to hide. The Morrison mansion stood like a fortress of American success on Round Hill Road, its Georgian, colonial architecture commanding respect from behind perfectly manicured hedges. Built in 1923 by railroad money, the house had weathered the Great Depression, World Wars, and countless family scandals with the same stoic dignity that old money families prize above all else. When I first walked through those heavy oak doors in 2018, the smell of lemon oil and fresh flowers masked something else entirely. The metallic scent of desperation that comes when wealth begins to crack at its foundation. Charles Morrison, III, had inherited not just the house, but the burden of maintaining a lifestyle that required more money than his trust fund could provide. His first wife, Catherine, had been the perfect society matron, organizing charity galas and country club events with the same precision she used to run their household. Their 2 children, Bradley and Sophia, grew up believing that privilege was a birthright, not a responsibility. The family employed a full staff, a gardener, a driver, a cook, and Maria Santos, the woman who would become the heartbeat of that house. Maria Santos arrived at the Morrison estate in 2008, carrying nothing but a worn suitcase and dreams of providing for her family back in El Salvador. She was 28 then, with calloused hands that spoke of hard work and gentle eyes that somehow retained hope despite the struggles that had brought her to America. Mrs. Catherine Morrison had hired her through an agency, looking for someone who could handle the demanding schedule of a household that entertained senators, business leaders, and old money families whose names appeared on museum wings and university buildings. From her first day, Maria approached her work with a dedication that went far beyond duty. She learned that Mr. Morrison preferred his coffee at exactly 6:30 a.m., strong and black, served in the Wedgwood china cup that had belonged to his grandfather. She discovered that Mrs. Morrison collected rare orchids and needed someone who understood that each variety required different care, different light, different attention. She memorized the way young Bradley liked his sandwiches, cut diagonally, not straight, and how Sophia needed her school uniform pressed just so, with creases sharp enough to pass military inspection. But Maria's real gift wasn't in the details of housekeeping. It was in understanding that a house becomes a home through the accumulation of small kindnesses, unspoken gestures, and the quiet presence of someone who truly cares. When Bradley broke his arm falling from his bicycle, Maria sat beside his bed reading stories in her accented English until he fell asleep. When Sophia struggled with algebra, Maria would clear the kitchen table after dinner and help her work through problems, even though mathematics had never been Maria's strength. When Mrs. Morrison's mother died, it was Maria who knew to serve tea in the good china and to play Vivaldi softly in the background, because grief needed both ceremony and comfort. Those early years felt like a golden age in the Morrison household. The family's wealth provided security, but Maria's presence provided something money couldn't buy: genuine warmth. She worked 6 days a week, sending most of her earnings to her elderly parents and younger sister in San Salvador, keeping only enough to share a small apartment with 3 other women in Stamford. Her life was built around sacrifice, but she never spoke of it as hardship. When Mrs. Morrison offered her Christmas bonuses, Maria would always ask if she could use the money to bring her sister to visit instead of keeping it for herself. The children grew to depend on Maria in ways that went beyond her official duties. She attended Bradley's soccer games when his parents were traveling, cheering from the sidelines in her one good dress. She helped Sophia choose her prom dress, understanding instinctively that a teenage girl needed someone to tell her she was beautiful, especially when her own mother was too busy managing social obligations to notice. Maria became the keeper of family traditions, remembering birthdays when parents forgot, making sure the house felt festive during holidays, and maintaining the rhythms that make a family feel like more than just people who share an address. Those were the years when the Morrison family still had enough money to be generous, enough security to be kind. Mr. Morrison would slip Maria extra cash when her sister needed medical care, always with the instruction that it was just between us. Mrs. Morrison would give Maria her barely worn designer clothes, understanding that dignity sometimes comes disguised as hand-me-downs. The family included Maria in their Christmas card photo one year, a small gesture that meant everything to a woman who had left her own family thousands of miles away. But wealth, like youth, is often more fragile than it appears. The first cracks in the Morrison Foundation were invisible to outsiders, hidden behind the same confident smiles that had graced society pages for decades. It started with Mr. Morrison's investment firm, a boutique operation that managed money for other old Connecticut families. The 2016 market volatility had been rough, but manageable. The real problems began when Charles Morrison III started making increasingly desperate bets, trying to recover losses with borrowed money and borrowed time. I remember the morning in 2018 when I first noticed the change. Mr. Morrison's coffee cup sat untouched as he stared at his laptop screen, his face gray with exhaustion and something that looked dangerously close to fear. Mrs. Morrison moved through the house like a woman underwater, going through the motions of her routine but missing the essential spark that had always defined her. The children, now in college, came home to a house that looked the same but felt fundamentally different, as if someone had replaced all the furniture with exact replicas that somehow lacked the original warmth. Maria noticed the changes before anyone else. She saw how Mr. Morrison started working later, taking phone calls that made him pace the study like a caged animal. She observed how Mrs. Morrison began drinking wine with lunch, just a glass, but earlier each day. She watched the way both parents snapped at each other over trivial things, their voices carrying the sharp edge that comes when people are afraid but can't admit it, even to themselves. The financial pressure manifested in small ways at first. The weekly flower deliveries stopped. The gardener's hours were reduced. The driver was let go, with Mrs. Morrison claiming she preferred to drive herself anyway. But Maria's position seemed secure, even sacred. She wasn't just an employee, she was family. Or so everyone believed. Hey, if this story is hitting close to home, drop the word loyalty in the comments below. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button, because stories like this remind us what really matters in life. Now, let me tell you what happened next, because you won't believe how quickly everything changed. The call came on a rainy Thursday in March 2019. Mrs. Morrison's voice was different when she summoned Maria to the study. Controlled but brittle, like ice beginning to crack. The news was devastating and swift. Mr. Morrison had suffered a massive heart attack while at his office. The paramedics had done everything possible, but Charles Morrison III was gone at 58, leaving behind a grieving family and financial chaos that would take months to unravel. Maria's grief was as deep as any family member's. She had served this man his coffee every morning for 11 years, had pressed his shirts, had listened to his concerns about his children's futures. His death left a hole in the daily rhythm of the house that no amount of rearranging could fill. But grief, Maria would learn, is a luxury that employees cannot always afford, especially when the people who employ them are drowning in their own sorrow and fear. The funeral was everything the Morrison family represented: dignified, expensive, and perfectly orchestrated. The church overflowed with Connecticut's elite, politicians, business leaders, and old money families who had known the Morrisons for generations. Maria sat in the back, wearing her best black dress, tears streaming down her face as she listened to eulogies that described a man she had known in ways these speakers never could. She knew he worried about living up to his father's legacy. She knew he called his mother every Sunday. She knew he was afraid his children didn't respect him. After the funeral, the family retreated to their grief and their lawyers. The reading of the will revealed what many had suspected. Charles Morrison III had left behind more debts than assets. The investment firm was essentially bankrupt, having lost not only the family's money but substantial sums belonging to their clients. The house, mortgaged beyond its value, would need to be sold. The lifestyle that had defined the Morrison family for 3 generations was over. Mrs. Morrison, now Catherine Morrison, found herself a widow at 52, with limited skills for earning income and unlimited experience in spending it. Bradley and Sophia, both in expensive private colleges, would need to transfer to state schools or take on student loans their family name could no longer guarantee. The graceful decline that old money families sometimes manage was impossible. The Morrison fall would be as public as their success had been. In the midst of this family catastrophe, Maria continued working as if nothing had changed. She cleaned rooms that might soon belong to strangers. She maintained gardens that new owners would inherit. She prepared meals for a family that was learning to count pennies after a lifetime of ignoring dollars. Her own future was uncertain, but her dedication never wavered. If anything, she worked harder, as if her extra effort could somehow hold the family together through sheer force of will. But the universe, it seemed, had one more cruel twist in store for the Morrison family. 6 months after her husband's death, Catherine Morrison met Derek Blackwood at a grief support group in Greenwich. He was 45, recently divorced, and claimed to have made his fortune in real estate development. He was handsome in the way that money often makes men handsome, with perfect teeth, expensive clothes, and the confident manner of someone accustomed to getting what he wants. Derek's courtship of Catherine was swift and strategic. He understood that she was vulnerable, grieving, and terrified of losing her social status along with her money. He offered not just companionship but salvation, claiming he could rescue both her dignity and her finances. Within 8 months of her husband's death, Catherine Morrison became Catherine Blackwood in a small ceremony that the society pages described as intimate but which everyone understood as desperate. Derek moved into the Morrison mansion, with plans that he claimed would restore the family's fortune. He spoke of development deals in Florida, investment opportunities in emerging markets, and connections with international money that could fund a new beginning. Bradley and Sophia, desperate to believe their nightmare was ending, welcomed their new stepfather with gratitude that blinded them to the warning signs their mother chose to ignore. Maria saw what others missed or refused to see. Derek's business calls happened at odd hours and often in hushed tones. His associates, when they visited the house, had the hard faces and careful mannerisms of men who lived outside the law. The paperwork he spread across Mr. Morrison's old desk was printed on cheap stationery, not the heavy bond paper that legitimate businesses use. Most telling of all, Derek treated Maria not as family, but as hired help whose presence he barely tolerated. The changes began immediately after the honeymoon. Derek informed Maria that her services would no longer be needed 6 days a week. She would work only Monday through Friday. Her salary was reduced accordingly, but Catherine assured her it was temporary, just until Derek's business deals came through. Then Derek decided that Maria's quarters in the main house were needed for his home office, so she would need to use the small apartment above the garage instead. Each change was presented as reasonable, even necessary, but Maria felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. The family that had once treated her like a beloved aunt now regarded her as an expensive burden. Derek made no effort to hide his resentment of her presence, often commenting loudly about the cost of household staff in a house that could barely afford its mortgage payments. The relationship between Maria and Catherine, once built on mutual respect and genuine affection, began to deteriorate under Derek's influence. He had a gift for planting seeds of doubt, suggesting that Maria's loyalty to the family's memory was actually manipulation designed to protect her own position. He questioned whether they could really afford full-time help, whether Maria's age and accent might be off-putting to potential business associates, whether keeping her employed was really kindness or just expensive sentimentality. This is where the story gets really intense, and I promise you won't see what's coming next. Make sure you're subscribed because what Derek Blackwood was really up to will shock you to your core. Catherine, worn down by grief, financial stress, and Derek's constant pressure, began to see Maria through her new husband's eyes. The woman who had once been indispensable became, in Catherine's mind, a reminder of better times that were never coming back. Maria's presence was a daily reproach, evidence of the family's fall from grace and their inability to maintain the standards that had once defined them. The atmosphere in the house grew increasingly toxic. Derek would make comments about Maria's cooking, comparing it unfavorably to restaurants he claimed to frequent in New York. He questioned her cleaning methods, suggesting that her old-fashioned approach wasn't suitable for a house that needed to impress important business contacts. Most cruelly, he would speak about her in Spanish, incorrectly assuming she couldn't understand his crude remarks about her appearance and intelligence. Maria endured these insults with the same quiet dignity she had always shown, but the stress was taking its toll. She began losing weight, her usually perfect appearance becoming more fragile with each passing week. Her sister in El Salvador noticed the change during their weekly phone calls, begging Maria to leave a situation that was clearly making her miserable. But Maria couldn't abandon the family she had served for over a decade, especially when they seemed to need her most. The final chapter of Maria's time with the Morrison family began on a humid Tuesday morning in August 2020. Derek had been in the house for almost a year, and his promised business deals had yet to materialize. Instead, the family's financial situation had grown worse, with creditors becoming more aggressive and Catherine's desperation more apparent. The house that had once been a symbol of success was starting to feel like a prison, beautiful but essentially worthless to a family that could no longer afford to live in it. That morning, Derek received a phone call that lasted over an hour and involved enough shouting to wake everyone in the house. Maria, cleaning the upstairs hallway, couldn't help but overhear fragments of the conversation. Derek was arguing with someone about money, about timelines, about consequences that sounded more like threats than business negotiations. When he finally hung up, his face was flushed with anger and what looked suspiciously like fear. The change in Derek's behavior was immediate and dramatic. He began making frantic phone calls, scheduling meetings with people whose names he refused to share with Catherine. He spent hours locked in the study, going through files and shredding documents with the methodical intensity of someone trying to eliminate evidence. Most ominously, he started talking about the need to simplify the household, to reduce expenses and eliminate unnecessary complications. Maria's fate was sealed during a conversation she accidentally overheard between Derek and Catherine late that Tuesday night. Derek's voice was harsh, demanding, as he explained that keeping Maria employed was not just expensive but dangerous. He claimed that household staff were the biggest source of information leaks in wealthy families, that Maria's presence made it impossible to conduct business with the privacy his deals required. He convinced Catherine that letting Maria go wasn't just financially prudent but essential for the family's security. Catherine's agreement came reluctantly, but it came nonetheless. The woman who had once trusted Maria with her children's lives now viewed her as a potential threat to whatever scheme Derek was orchestrating. The decision was made. Maria Santos would be terminated immediately, given a generous severance package, and asked to sign documents ensuring her permanent silence about the family's affairs. What happened next would change everything, not just for Maria, but for the entire Morrison family. Derek's generous severance package was more than generous. It was suspicious, unprecedented, and large enough to raise questions that he desperately didn't want answered. The morning of Maria's dismissal dawned gray and humid, the kind of Connecticut weather that feels heavy with impending change. Maria arrived at the house at her usual time, 7 a.m. sharp, carrying the key she had been trusted with for over 12 years. She let herself in through the kitchen door, started the coffee that Catherine now drank stronger and earlier each day, and began the routine that had structured her life for more than a decade. Derek was waiting for her in the breakfast room, dressed in an expensive suit that somehow managed to look cheap on him. His usual superficial charm was nowhere in evidence. Instead, his face wore the hard expression of a man conducting unpleasant but necessary business. He gestured for Maria to sit down, but she remained standing, sensing that whatever was coming would be easier to absorb on her feet. The termination was swift and brutal. Derek informed Maria that her services were no longer needed, effective immediately. He claimed that the family's financial situation had deteriorated to the point where they could no longer afford household staff. He presented her with a sealed envelope, explaining that it contained her final paycheck plus what he called a generous severance payment in recognition of her years of loyal service. Maria's shock was total and immediate. After 15 years of dedication, she was being dismissed without warning, without explanation, and without the common courtesy of a conversation with Catherine herself. Derek made it clear that this decision was final and non-negotiable. He had already arranged for a car service to take her back to her apartment, and he expected her to be gone within the hour. The envelope Derek handed Maria contained a check that would make headlines when its amount was eventually revealed. The sum was $250,000. More money than Maria had earned in her entire 15 years with the family combined. It was an amount so large that it immediately raised questions about why Derek Blackwood would pay such an extraordinary sum to dismiss a household employee. But the check came with conditions. Along with the money, Derek presented Maria with a non-agreement that would have made a corporate lawyer proud. The document, thick with legal language that Maria couldn't fully understand, essentially required her to promise never to discuss her time with the Morrison family, never to mention Derek's business activities, and never to contact any member of the family again. The agreement included penalty clauses that would require Maria to repay the entire $250,000 if she violated any of its terms. Maria stared at the check, her hands trembling as she tried to process what was happening. $250,000 was more money than she had ever imagined having, enough to bring her entire family to America, enough to buy a house, enough to ensure her parents could live comfortably for the rest of their lives. But the strings attached to the money felt like chains, and the haste with which Derek was pushing her to sign suggested that she was being paid not for her years of service, but for her silence about something far more serious than household management. Derek's impatience grew as Maria hesitated. He began speaking faster, emphasizing the generosity of the severance package and the importance of making a clean break. He assured her that the non-disclosure agreement was standard procedure for wealthy families, designed to protect their privacy rather than hide any wrongdoing. But his nervous energy and obvious anxiety told a different story, one that Maria was beginning to understand despite her shock and confusion. The truth was that Derek Blackwood was not the successful real estate developer he claimed to be. His business was money laundering, and he had been using the Morrison mansion as the base for an operation that moved millions of dollars in illegal funds through fake real estate transactions. The foreign investors he claimed to represent were actually criminal organizations seeking to legitimize their profits through the American financial system. Derek had married Catherine not for love or even her remaining social connections, but because her family's reputation provided the perfect cover for his criminal enterprise. Maria had seen too much during her final months in the house. She had overheard phone conversations, seen documents, witnessed meetings that Derek now realized could destroy his entire operation. The $250,000 wasn't severance pay, it was hush money, designed to ensure that Maria Santos would disappear quietly and never speak about what she had observed in the Morrison mansion. But Derek had made a critical miscalculation. By offering Maria such an enormous sum, he had guaranteed that his attempt to buy her silence would instead draw attention to the very secrets he was trying to hide. When Maria walked out of that house clutching a check for $250,000, she was carrying evidence of Derek Blackwood's desperation and proof that something in the Morrison mansion was worth far more than a maid's silence. The moment Maria left the Morrison estate, Derek began the process of covering his tracks. He destroyed documents, canceled meetings, and started moving money out of accounts that could be traced back to his operation. But it was too late. The size of Maria's severance payment had already raised red flags at her bank, triggering automatic reports to federal authorities who monitored large cash transactions for signs of money laundering, and other financial crimes. Maria's decision about what to do with the check and the non-disclosure agreement would determine not just her own future, but the fate of everyone involved in Derek Blackwood's criminal enterprise. She could take the money, sign the papers, and walk away rich but complicit. Or she could do something that would require more courage than she had ever needed before. She could tell the truth. The ride from the Morrison mansion to Maria's small apartment in Stamford felt like a journey between two different worlds. In one hand, she held a check that represented more money than her family had seen in generations. In the other, she clutched the non-disclosure agreement that would make her complicit in whatever Derek Blackwood was hiding. The driver, professional and discreet, said nothing as Maria stared out the window at the Connecticut landscape rolling past, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. Back in her cramped apartment, Maria spread the documents across her small kitchen table and tried to make sense of what had just happened. The check was real. She confirmed that by calling the bank whose name was printed on it. The non-disclosure agreement was equally real, filled with legal language that essentially required her to pretend that 15 years of her life had never happened. But the more Maria studied the papers, the more convinced she became that she was being paid not for her silence about family secrets, but about something far more dangerous. Maria's sister Carmen had worked as a paralegal in San Salvador before emigrating to the United States 5 years earlier. Now living in Los Angeles and working for an immigration law firm, Carmen had developed a keen understanding of American legal documents and their implications. When Maria called her that evening, Carmen's reaction to the severance amount was immediate and alarmed. "Mia," Carmen said, her voice sharp with concern, "nobody pays $250,000 to fire a maid unless that maid knows something worth much more than $250,000. This isn't generosity, this is fear. This man is terrified of what you might say." Carmen's advice was clear and uncompromising. Maria should not sign the non-disclosure agreement, should not cash the check, and should immediately contact federal authorities about Derek Blackwood's suspicious behavior. She offered to fly to Connecticut to help Maria navigate the legal complexities, but she was adamant that accepting Derek's money would make Maria an accessory to whatever crimes he was committing. But Maria's situation was more complicated than Carmen understood. After 15 years in America, Maria was still not a citizen, still vulnerable to deportation if she lost her employment authorization. Taking Derek's money would allow her to live comfortably while pursuing legal status, but refusing it might leave her destitute and defenseless. The choice between financial security and moral clarity was not as simple as her sister believed. Maria spent 3 sleepless nights wrestling with her decision. She walked the streets of Stamford, attended evening mass at St. Cecilia's, and prayed for guidance that seemed slow in coming. She thought about her parents in El Salvador, aging, and increasingly dependent on the money she sent home each month. She considered her own future as a woman in her late 30s with limited skills and uncertain legal status in a country that was becoming increasingly hostile to immigrants. But mostly, Maria thought about the Morrison children, Bradley and Sophia, who had once trusted her completely, and who were now trapped in a house with a stepfather whose true nature they couldn't see. Whatever Derek was involved in would eventually destroy them, along with their mother. And Maria's silence would make her partially responsible for that destruction. The decision came to Maria during Sunday Mass, as Father Rodriguez spoke about the parable of the talents and the responsibility to use our gifts in service of truth and justice. Maria realized that her years in the Morrison household had given her something more valuable than money. Knowledge about Derek Blackwood's operation that could protect other families from the same exploitation that was destroying the people she had served loyally for 15 years. On Monday morning, exactly 1 week after her termination, Maria Santos walked into the FBI field office in New Haven, Connecticut. She carried with her the uncashed check for $250,000, the unsigned non-disclosure agreement, and a detailed account of everything she had observed during Derek Blackwood's time in the Morrison mansion. Her English was imperfect, but her memory was precise, and her courage was absolute. The FBI agents who interviewed Maria were initially skeptical. The idea that a domestic worker could provide crucial intelligence about a sophisticated money laundering operation seemed unlikely. But as Maria described the phone calls she had overheard, the documents she had seen, and the suspicious patterns of behavior she had witnessed, the agents began to realize that she had been an unwitting observer of a criminal enterprise that had been operating under their radar for months. Maria's information provided the missing pieces of an investigation that federal agents had been conducting into a network of illegal financial transactions moving through Connecticut real estate. Derek Blackwood's name had appeared on their radar, but they had lacked the evidence needed to obtain search